Okay, there are a few topics left we want to talk about tuples. Well, this topic is how do we want to unpack a tuple? Okay, so for example, I have another album. Well, again in 1980s. Okay, well, and then I know the first one is the title of the album. The second one is the name of the artist, and then followed by the year. Okay, well, I pack three of the informations together into one tuple, and that tuple name is called budgie. Okay, well, on the opposite, since I can pack three pieces together into a tuple, I should be able to do something reverse, right? So I should also be able to unpack a tuple, and that is the second line. That is, I'm assigning the tuple budgie to three variable names. Those three variable names are title, artist, and year. So I'm trying to assign one tuple with three items to three variable names. So one tuple, three items, and then to three variable names. So well, the first one gets the first part of the budgie, and the second one, the second name artist got the second part of the budgie, and then the last variable name year got the last part of budgie. So I got a tuple unpacked. Okay, so after I unpack a tuple, and then I can do some printing if I want to. So well, the last thing is, well, we can even return a tuple. Well, and probably you don't see that very often, but say when you go to higher level Python programming, and then you will see some functions, they are returning multiple items. Well, for example, like this, return parentheses C and A. So it is still one return. But what is this function returning? It is returning a C and A as a tuple, right? So, well, in other words, I'm putting together multiple values into a tuple, and then I'm returning a tuple from this function. So even from the syntax, it's still that returning only one item, but it is a tuple. This means we can pack multiple items into a tuple if we want to. Well, and in some cases, if you do process multiple items in the function, and then you want to return multiple items from your function, and then you gotta return a tuple. Okay, well, and then let's see this one. So for this one, we are calculating the circumference and the size of a circle, so or the area. Okay, well, we are receiving a radius r. So how do we get the circumference? And this is the 2 multiplied by pi multiplied by the radius. So that is the circumference. And the second one, how do we get the area of this circle? And this is the pi multiplied by r square. So that is the area. So using this radius, we are able to calculate the circumference and the area. Now, I want to put those two values together into a tuple, so I'm returning this tuple. Okay, so I can do return and C comma A. So I'm putting those two things together, and then I'm returning that as a tuple. Okay, so that's it for the lecture part of today. Well, and oh, well, sorry. Here's one more thing. Well, when I'm calling the circle info, I'm sending the radius as a 10, and then I know for this function cal, it's going to return two variables in a tuple. The first one will be the C for circumference, and then the second one will be A, right? So since I know there will be a tuple of two items returned, so how about I just unpack this return tuple right when the return value comes here. So I made this function cal, and then this function cal is going to give me a circumference and the area as a tuple, and then when after I do this function cal, I do want to unpack those two pieces of the information immediately, so I can do two variable names, circumference, comma, area equals this function cal. Okay, so that's it for the lecture part. And here's one more thing I want to remind you. Well, we are going to have a coding final exam, and then there is likely to be 11 questions. Okay, so those are going to be the topics. So the first one, if only. So you, for example, well, this is probably an easy one. You receive an integer from your function, and then you are going to return even or odd based on whether this value can be evenly divisible by 2 or not, right? So this is a if only question. So we are only testing one thing, which is the conditions. Well, and the next one for the loop only. So well, that is, for example, you are gonna do an iteration from 1 to 100, and then you add all the values together, and then the return result should be 50-50. Okay, and then for the loop with the if, and then you are still doing the iteration, but inside of this iteration, and then you are going to have a if condition or if else as well. So for example, from 1 to 100, instead of adding all the values together, I want you to add all the even values together. And then from 1 to 100, and then you have to, for each value you are visiting, you have to first test whether it's an even value or odd value. If it is an even value, I want to add that to the total, right? So you have to make sure you are only adding the even value. So that will be something you are going to see for the if only. And then we have the nested loops, and we have the list iteration with the content, list iteration with the index. So what are the difference? Let me remind you about this part. Say I have my list equals, say 10, hello, and then 3.14 and 2. Okay, well, if I want to do a iteration like for I in my list, and then colon print I. So what is that? So this is called a iteration using I as the control variable to visit the values one by one, right? So this will be this topic, iteration on the list using the content. Okay, and how about using the index? So well, we can still do the same thing, but now I want to write the code differently. I will be for I in the range of the length of my list. And then if you want to do visit all the items one by one, how can you do that? Now I is no longer visiting the items. I is an index. So I have to do print my list with the index I. So for those two variants, they're exactly the same, but this variant is to iterate the items on a list using I as one item or one content in the list. However, for this variant, we are using I as an index, right? So that's the difference between those two topics, and you are required to know how to code both of them. Okay, and then file reading, file writing, and we have already tested that on the midterm coding midterm 2, and then dictionary, which will be our next topic. And then, well, the next question, multiple ways to write that. Well, this will be a slightly harder question, and there could be some easier ways, there could be some harder ways, but you can come up with different ways to code that. But this question, let me warn you, this question is likely to be slightly harder than the rest of them. And the last question will be the debugging. Well, you are going to receive a code with some issues. It could be when you run that and then you have an exception. Or it could be you run that and there's no error message. However, this function doesn't give you exactly the right output. Well, remember, we have debugging questions in the written midterm 1 and the written midterm 2. So those are going to be some of the similar questions you're going to see to the one on the final exam. Okay. Well, and the last thing, let me also remind you this. Well, you may say, okay, on the topic list on the left side, there's no tuple, right? There's no tuple, so I don't have to watch today's lecture. No, it's not true, because there are some other topics. They are also important, but they are not listed on the topic to be tested doesn't mean you won't see them. And let me give you an example. Like today we talk about how we can return a tuple as a return value from a function, right? And then for some of the function here, they may require you to return a tuple. So you have to know how to do that, right? And for example, we also didn't talk about the nested list on this part. So is nested list going to be tested? Yes, that's possible. So we have a nested loop question, right? Well, in this nested loop question, we can use that to ask you to visit all the members of a nested list one by one. So for some of the topics, even though you don't see on the topics to be tested in the coding final, they could still fit. Another good example will be the strings. We didn't have the strings on this list, but we may test the list. Well, and for the chain and nested conditions, yes, well, you may see that or you may have to use that in some of the questions. And there are some built-in functions. Like, well, today we talk about the list object dot sort. So we can sort the list in place. So, well, this could be a requirement in some of the coding questions in the final exam too. So, well, when you are studying for your final exam, you definitely want to visit all the lectures of this semester. Okay, so well, that's it for today's lecture part, and I will make another video for today's exercise.